Every true crime mystery has two timelines, the one recorded by forensic evidence and the one quietly written in the human heart long before a crime takes place. To understand the tragic, high-stakes disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie from her home in the Catalina Foothills of Tucson, Arizona, we cannot simply look at the chaotic digital ransom notes or the grainy security footage of an armed intruder. We have to ask a deeply unsettling, psychological question. What was Nancy Guthrie actually afraid of? At 84, Nancy, mother of Today Show co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, was a woman of immense strength, but she was also a woman forced to confront the stark realities of aging. When we look past her public identity as the matriarch of a prominent media family, we find an independent widow living alone in a sprawling desert landscape. Psychologists specializing in geriatric victimology point out that the elderly do not look at the world through the same lens of security as the young. Their fears are deeply specific. They are afraid of physical entrapment. They are afraid of a sudden medical crisis occurring in isolation, where their voice cannot carry past their own walls. Most of all, they are afraid of the precise moment their hard-won independence becomes a vulnerability, exploited by the dark. Nancy suffered from limited physical mobility and a serious, chronic heart condition that required life-sustaining daily medication. She wore a pacemaker, a medical device that acted as both a silent guardian for her heart and, tragically, the ultimate digital anchor for her timeline. Her routine was deliberate, carefully constructed around her physical challenges. On the night of Saturday, January 31st, 2026, after a peaceful evening of dinner and games with her daughter Annie and son-in-law Tommaso Cioni, she was dropped off at her single-story home at 9:50 p.m. As her garage door clicked shut, sealing her into the darkness of the Arizona night, Nancy was entering the exact environment that statistics show older adults fear most. A house isolated by the vast, quiet washes of the desert, where an individual must rely entirely on external technology to signal for help. The Catalina Foothills of Tucson are celebrated for their dramatic views and extreme privacy. Properties are separated by natural desert terrain, deep arroyos, and dense stands of saguaro cacti. But for an elderly person living alone, privacy is a double-edged sword. The very design that keeps the outside world at bay also creates a vacuum of absolute silence. If a crisis occurs, neighbors cannot hear a cry for help over the sound of the desert wind. This brings us to the first dimension of Nancy's underlying anxieties, the fear of technological failure. In our modern era, we have been conditioned to believe that smart home security systems, doorbell cameras, motion sensors, smartphone linkages, have made the traditional fortress obsolete. We trust the digital lens to watch over our elderly parents when we cannot be there physically. But for a woman of Nancy's generation, there is often a lingering, intuitive distrust of these invisible layers of protection. She knew that her safety rested on a delicate network of wireless signals and glass lenses. And in the early hours of Sunday, February 1st, 2026, those fears materialized with terrifying precision. An armed, masked predator stepped onto her porch. He did not attempt a clumsy smash-and-grab entry. He moved with cold, tactical familiarity, targeting her Google Nest doorbell camera first. At exactly 1:47 a.m., the camera stream went dead. It was disconnected and physically removed from the property. For 25 minutes, Nancy remained inside her home, entirely unaware that her first line of digital defense had been systematically blinded. The suspect, described by the FBI as a male between 5'9" and 5'10" tall, wearing a visible handgun holster and carrying a heavily packed 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack, was preparing to breach the interior. When the backdoor logs registered an intrusion at 2:12 a.m., Nancy's worst psychological fear became an immediate, physical reality. She was trapped inside her own home, stripped of her digital eyes, facing an armed stranger in the dead of night. There is a distinct horror in the realization that your body's vital systems are monitored by technology that can track the exact moment of your trauma. Nancy's pacemaker was synchronized via an app on her smartphone, sending regular data logs to a bedside monitor. This setup is designed to offer peace of mind to elderly patients and their distant families, a digital guarantee that if the heart falters, an alert will be generated. But what happens when the threat is not internal, but external? At exactly 2:28 a.m., the bedside monitor recorded a fatal communication error. The app on Nancy's phone completely lost its wireless connection to her pacemaker. For forensic analysts and behavioral profilers, this is the most devastating timestamp of the entire case. It tells a chronological story without words. It means that by 2:28 a.m., 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie had been forcefully breached, physically subdued, and moved out of her bedroom, beyond the short wireless range of her life-sustaining equipment. What was Nancy Guthrie experiencing in those frantic final minutes within her home? The physical evidence left behind paint a harrowing picture that mirrors the exact nightmares of vulnerable adults. On the front steps and the porch, investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department discovered distinct drops and trails of blood. DNA testing quickly confirmed the blood belonged entirely to Nancy. The presence of blood at the threshold indicates a violent physical struggle. For a woman with severe mobility challenges, a sudden, aggressive confrontation would cause an immediate, catastrophic spike in heart rate and blood pressure. As she was forced across her own porch into the cold night air, leaving her phone, her Apple Watch, and her vital daily heart medications resting on their charging cradles inside, she was living out the ultimate manifestation of helplessness, a total disconnect from the medical and digital lifelines keeping her alive. To truly answer what Nancy was afraid of, we must also look at what her captors were not afraid of. Criminal profilers tracking the case emphasize that the perpetrator operated with an extreme, short-sighted cognitive bias. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos has hinted that investigators have a strong understanding of the underlying motive, though they have kept specific strategic details closely guarded. The profile of the intruder is that of a calculated opportunist, someone who likely recognized the affluent nature of the Catalina Foothills, noted an elderly woman living alone, and made a high-stakes connection to her famous daughter, Savannah Guthrie. The kidnapper looked at Nancy Guthrie and saw a symbol of wealth, an access point to millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency. But in doing so, he committed a fatal, short-sighted error that reveals the psychological profile of an amateur executing a high-tech crime. He failed to see the fragile human reality of his target. He did not calculate that an 84-year-old heart patient cannot survive the intense, suffocating trauma of an armed abduction. This total disconnect between the criminal's expectations and the victim's physical reality became clear in the days immediately following February 1st. The kidnapper began blasting encrypted ransom notes via email to major media outlets, including the celebrity news site TMZ, and local Tucson television stations Cold and Communin. The first notes were arrogant, demanding $4 million in Bitcoin and establishing rigid, high-stakes deadlines. They claimed Nancy was safe but cared for, but investigators quickly sensed a growing undercurrent of panic in the digital trail. The FBI deposited a trace amount of Bitcoin into the provided crypto wallet in an attempt to unmask the routing paths, but the captors never followed through with traditional negotiation steps. They had realized, with mounting dread, that their hostage was not a stable asset. She was a severe medical liability, who was rapidly slipping away without her daily prescription regimen. The agonizing silence that gripped the Guthrie family throughout the spring was shattered in June, when a second, devastating communication was authenticated by federal authorities. Sent from the exact same digital IP address as the original cryptocurrency demands, this email completely abandoned the aggressive extortion narrative. The tone had inverted from financial arrogance to defensive self-preservation. The writer claimed that they never intended for Nancy to die, offering a detached, hollow apology. The email contained a phrase that confirmed the family's deepest, most agonizing fears. Nancy had passed away shortly after the abduction, and she was now buried with nature. For the Guthrie family, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, this confession was an absolute emotional execution. It meant that while they were offering a massive $1 million reward, and making raw, desperate public pleas on national television, Nancy had likely been gone for months, left in the vast wilderness of the Southwest. From an investigative standpoint, the phrase, "buried with nature," points directly to the geographical reality of southern Arizona. The desert surrounding Tucson is vast, stretching down toward the Arizona-Mexico border, filled with thousands of square miles of rugged arroyos, abandoned mines, and punishing mountain terrain. Criminologists note that when a kidnapping goes wrong and a victim dies of medical distress or trauma, perpetrators almost always experience an immediate psychological collapse. They panic, abandon their financial goals, and seek to hide the physical evidence of their failure in the most isolated terrain available, hoping the environment will erase their ties to the crime. They leave the family in a state of permanent, unresolved torment, simply to buy themselves distance from a capital murder charge. As the search shifted from a rescue mission to a complex, forensic recovery operation, a new layer of psychological terror emerged for the family, driven by the modern phenomenon of digital true crime exploitation. When news organizations publicly disclosed the existence of the Buried with Nature ransom notes in late June, internet sleuths, content creators, and armchair detectives swarmed the case, turning a real-world tragedy into an algorithmic spectacle. Online forums began dissecting every aspect of Nancy's family life. In a cruel twist of narrative distortion, internet commentators began mapping the phrase, "buried with nature," against the past creative writings and poetry of Nancy's daughter, Annie Guthrie, and her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni. Sleuths baselessly claimed that because the word nature appeared in family creative projects, the abduction must be an inside job, focusing intensely on photos of Cioni and generating wild, unfounded conspiracy theories for digital engagement. This digital onslaught represents a distinct modern fear that many high-profile families face: the fear of losing control over the truth of your own tragedy. The noise generated by these online rumor mills became so disruptive that the Pima County Sheriff's Department had to repeatedly remind the public that family members were completely cleared of suspicion. On June 23rd, Savannah Guthrie stood before the nation at the Today Show desk, visibly shaken, holding a tissue, and made an emotional appeal to the public to look past the sensationalism and come forward with real, actionable tips. "We are in agony, and we cannot be at peace," she said, delivering a raw defense of her family against both the physical monsters who took her mother and the digital ones exploiting their grief. The investigation entered an even more chaotic phase in late June, when a new anonymous email surfaced, sent directly to TMZ. This sender claimed to possess a hidden smartphone stored in a secure location containing a definitive video of Nancy Guthrie alongside her main kidnapper, as well as the names, ages, and addresses of everyone involved in the plot. The price for the phone's coordinates was set at a single Bitcoin. However, the elite tiers of federal behavioral profiling quickly saw through the transmission. Retired FBI profiler James Fitzgerald publicly dismantled the claim, noting that the erratic, low-stakes media negotiation was entirely inconsistent with a real co-conspirator. "This guy, I don't think he's legit," Fitzgerald stated bluntly. "I don't think any of them are authentic, and that includes this most recent one." The FBI has since pivoted its focus toward an electronic blockade, using advanced digital forensics to isolate the individual responsible for the original, verified IP addresses. Polygraph and forensic experts like Lisa Ribicoff have suggested that the FBI may already be closed-loop on the suspect's identity, choosing to go silent and stop engaging with media leaks to prevent a final destruction of evidence. Former FBI agents estimate that investigators are extremely close to a major break, with predictions pointing toward significant movement by August 1st. Forensic analysts are currently painstakingly reviewing choke point traffic cameras, green cam feeds, and cell tower dumps from the dark hours of January 31st to match a specific vehicle to the DNA and digital footprints left inside the home. The case is described not as cold, but as a fire hose of active, behind-the-scenes investigative momentum. Ultimately, The story of Nancy Guthrie is a profound tragedy that answers its own central question with devastating clarity. Nancy Guthrie was not afraid of the desert, nor was she afraid of living an independent life. She was afraid of the moment her physical vulnerabilities would be turned against her in the dark, separated from the family she built and the medication she required to survive. But as the federal net tightens around the masked figure from the porch, the final message of this case belongs to her children. Greed may have breached her sanctuary, but it cannot withstand the unyielding light of a family and a nation that will never stop looking until she is brought home. When an independent adult of advanced age chooses to remain in her own home, that choice is often a daily act of defiance against her own anxieties. Nancy Guthrie did not stay in the Catalina Foothills because she felt entirely invincible. She stayed because her desire for personal autonomy outweighed her fear of isolation. But for families of elderly individuals living alone, there is a parallel, quiet anxiety that runs alongside that independence. The constant, underlying dread of the phone call that arrives in the middle of the night. Behavioral scientists who study the aftermath of elder abductions note that the trauma radiates outward, completely shattering the psychological safety of the surviving family. For Savannah, Annie, and Cameron, the realization that Nancy's vulnerabilities were weaponized against her creates a profound sense of proximity to the danger. They are forced to reframe every memory of her quiet home, turning a place of warmth, family dinners, and holiday gatherings into a clinical forensic grid mapped out by drops of blood and disabled wires. The fear that Nancy lived out her final hours in a state of absolute medical and physical duress is a heavy, permanent psychological weight that her children must carry. Every day, the case remains unresolved. To fully understand the threat environment that Nancy faced, we have to look at the structural reality of senior isolation in suburban America. The Catalina Foothills represent a specific architectural design that prioritizes deep setbacks, natural desert landscaping, and minimal street lighting to preserve the natural beauty of the Arizona night. While these features are highly desirable for affluent homeowners seeking an escape from the city, they inadvertently create an optimal operational theater for low-risk criminal surveillance. A stalker or opportunist can sit in the deep shadows of a desert wash for hours, observing the lights turning on and off within a home, mapping out the precise layout of a single-story residence without ever attracting the attention of neighboring properties. For an elderly resident with limited mobility, whose daily routine is predictable out of medical necessity, this environmental exposure is an extreme vulnerability. Nancy's fear of being watched was not an irrational paranoia. It was a structural reality of living in an area where the terrain favors the intruder. The moment her son-in-law's car drove away at 9:48 p.m., the house returned to its natural state of geographic isolation, leaving her completely exposed to a predator who had already calculated the exact time required to breach her perimeter unseen. In the history of criminal justice, the evolution of forensic evidence has shifted from physical fingerprints to digital anomalies. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the most compelling, heartbreaking witness to the crime is an inanimate object, the bedside pacemaker monitor. This device represents the convergence of modern medicine and personal security, a tool meant to alleviate an elderly patient's fear of a silent, unassisted cardiac failure. Yet, in a cruel twist of technological irony, the pacemaker did not save Nancy from her captor. Instead, it acted as a precise, digital stenographer of her abduction. When the app lost connection at 2:28 a.m., it provided investigators with an absolute boundary of time and space. It proved that the intruder had successfully bypassed the physical barriers of the home, neutralized Nancy's ability to access a landline or panic button, and was actively transporting her away from her sanctuary. This digital data point strips away the suspect's ability to fabricate an alibi or claim a different timeline of events. The pacemaker's silent testimony ensured that from the very first day of the investigation, the FBI was tracking a highly defined, fast-moving abduction window, forcing the perpetrators to operate under an intense timeline that they never anticipated. There is an underlying danger that attaches itself to families of prominent public figures. a unique vulnerability that Nancy Guthrie likely understood all too well. When your daughter is a fixture on national television, anchoring one of the most watched morning broadcasts in the country, your family's private life inadvertently becomes partially visible to the world. For a criminal looking for a high-value target, this public visibility provides a ready-made profile of perceived wealth and leverage. The kidnapper did not target Nancy because of who she was as an individual. He targeted her because of who her daughter was to the public. This is the ultimate exploitation of maternal vulnerability, using a mother's physical isolation to exert massive, high-stakes psychological pressure on a public figure. Nancy's deep-seated anxieties about her family's safety were inverted. It was her connection to her family that ultimately drew the danger to her doorstep. The extortionist calculated that the sheer terror of a national media anchor losing her mother would force an immediate, quiet compliance with multimillion-dollar Bitcoin demands, completely failing to understand that a high-profile target instantly commands the unyielding, global investigative resources of the federal government. When a violent crime breaches a quiet, upscale community like the Catalina Foothills, the psychological damage extends far beyond the immediate family of the victim. It causes a profound, systemic rupture of trust among the residents, forcing an entire neighborhood to confront the reality of their own vulnerability. For decades, the Foothills were viewed as a safe haven, a place where retired professionals and independent seniors could live without the constant fear of urban crime. In the wake of February 1st, that collective sense of security completely evaporated. The presence of forensic units, FBI command centers, and search teams combing the desert washes transformed the peaceful suburb into an active war zone against crime. Older residents, who previously enjoyed solitary morning walks or kept their blinds open to take in the desert views, began retreating behind locked doors, installing secondary security gates, and auditing their personal alarm systems. The fear that a masked, armed stranger could systematically dismantle a smart home system and abduct a neighbor from her bed turned a peaceful sanctuary into an environment of profound, shared anxiety, proving that a single act of violence can alter the social landscape of an entire community. The immediate escalation of the Nancy Guthrie investigation into a multi-agency federal operation reflects the extreme severity with which the American justice system treats the abduction of a vulnerable citizen. When local deputies first arrived at the home at 12:15 p.m. on Sunday and discovered the missing security camera and blood on the porch, the procedural alarm went off across multiple jurisdictions. This was not treated as a standard missing person inquiry. It was immediately categorized as a forced kidnapping, with high indicators of life-threatening duress. The integration of the FBI's kidnapping units, alongside the Pima County Sheriff's Department, created an ironclad investigative shield around the case. This mobilization brought advanced federal assets into Tucson, including behavioral profilers, cellular tracking specialists, and dark web forensic analysts trained to trace encrypted cryptocurrency networks. This overwhelming response was designed to meet the exact fear that older adults have when facing a crisis. The fear that their disappearance will be overlooked or slow to trigger a response. The federalization of the search ensured that every resource of the state was deployed within hours, sending an unmistakable message to the captors that they were no longer running from a local sheriff, but were actively hunted by the full authority of the United States government. The physical geography of the Sonoran Desert plays an active, menacing role in the narrative of Nancy's disappearance. For those who live in Tucson, the desert is a source of beauty and quiet reflection. But for an elderly woman stripped of her mobility aids and daily medications, the desert transforms into a brutal, indifferent wall of environmental peril. The terrain is defined by extreme temperature shifts, dropping rapidly into the low 40s on winter nights, and rising into punishing 100-degree heat as the seasons turn toward summer. When the ransom notes claimed that Nancy was buried with nature, they confirmed the worst environmental anxieties that families of missing persons endure. The desert does not yield its secrets easily. Its deep arroyos, hidden washes, and dense brush can conceal physical evidence for months. acting as a natural shield for perpetrators seeking to hide their tracks. The logistical challenge of searching hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain requires search teams to use advanced drones, thermal imaging, and desert-trained K-9 units, turning the recovery effort into a meticulous, scientific battle against the elements to uncover the truth the kidnappers tried to leave behind in the wild. The intersection of media ethics and active criminal investigations becomes incredibly fraught when a case involves the family of a prominent journalist. When news organizations like Cold and CNN first received the authenticated ransom notes indicating that Nancy had passed away, they held information that was of massive public interest, but also possessed the potential to entirely compromise the integrity of the hunt. The choice by these outlets to maintain a strict informational blockade for weeks, withholding the devastating contents of the letters at the request of the FBI, demonstrates a profound, necessary boundary in modern journalism. Publicizing the kidnappers' claims immediately could have caused them to panic further, destroy evidence, or flee the country before their digital footprints could be traced. This strategic silence protected the active leads of the investigation, ensuring that the pursuit of a breaking headline never took precedence over the pursuit of absolute justice for a grieving family. There is a distinct behavioral shift that occurs when a high-stakes criminal plot collapses under the weight of its own logistical failure. The initial demands sent by Nancy's captors were characterized by a cold, calculating arrogance, a belief that cryptocurrency would grant them total immunity while they extracted millions from a desperate family. They operated with the confidence of digital extortionists who believed they held all the cards. But when Nancy succumbed to the immense physiological stress of the abduction and the absence of her heart medication, the psychological dynamic inverted instantly. The captors were suddenly forced to confront the reality that they were no longer looking at a financial score. They were looking at a capital murder investigation. The summer communication sent in June reveals a group in absolute panic, attempting to retroactively minimize their culpability by claiming her death was an accident and offering detached apologies. This behavioral collapse is a classic pattern in botched kidnappings, where the perpetrators realize the net is closing around them and begin focusing entirely on their own survival, leaving a trail of erratic digital moves that investigators are now using to pinpoint their location. The explosion of true crime content on digital platforms has introduced a secondary, deeply predatory element into modern criminal investigations. For the Guthrie family, the trauma of Nancy's disappearance was exacerbated by the relentless actions of independent internet sleuths who turned their private agony into content designed to generate clicks and revenue. The targeting of Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni by online rumor mills highlights the complete absence of empathy that often characterizes online true crime subcultures. Armchair detectives parsed old poetry and creative writings, constructing fictional inside job narratives based on superficial word matching with the ransom notes. This algorithmic cruelty creates a massive amount of noise that law enforcement must actively filter through, pulling valuable resources away from real leads to clear the names of grieving family members. It proves that families navigating a public tragedy must not only survive the physical crime itself, but must also withstand the digital distortions of a hyper-connected world that treats human suffering as a game for online engagement. One of the foundational errors made by modern digital extortionists is the belief that cryptocurrency provides an unbreachable wall of absolute anonymity. The captors who abducted Nancy Guthrie based their entire financial exit strategy on this myth, assuming that by demanding millions in Bitcoin, they could collect their payout without ever leaving a physical or electronic trace. In reality, the blockchain is a public, permanent ledger, and federal cyber forensics units possess highly sophisticated tools designed to track the movement of digital assets across global networks. The moment the FBI deposited a small, controlled amount of Bitcoin into the kidnapper's account, that wallet became an electronic beacon. Every subsequent attempt to transfer, split, or cash out those funds leaves a distinct digital footprint that links directly to specific exchange points and IP infrastructure. The myth of crypto-anonymity has become the very trap that is exposing the perpetrators, transforming their calculated financial scheme into the primary piece of evidence that will ultimately lead to their arrest. The systemic vulnerabilities exposed by the Nancy Guthrie case have catalyzed an urgent national conversation regarding the legislative and technological protections afforded to independent seniors. As our population ages, the number of older adults choosing to live alone in suburban and rural areas continues to rise, creating a pressing need for enhanced safety infrastructures tailored to their specific needs. Advocacy groups are now leveraging this tragedy to push for the implementation of Nancy's law-proposed legislation that would mandate the integration of automated emergency alert systems within home health monitoring devices. Under this framework, if a critical medical device like a pacemaker experiences a sudden, unauthorized disconnection from its home monitoring station during late-night hours, it would automatically trigger a high-priority wellness check by local law enforcement dispatch. By closing the time gap between an intrusion and the arrival of first responders, these institutional reforms aim to ensure that independent seniors are protected by an unbreachable network of safety, turning a profound collective tragedy into a lasting shield for the nation's elderly. The profound emotional impact of Nancy's disappearance resonated deeply within the professional community of national broadcast journalism. Savannah Guthrie's role as the anchor of NBC's Today Show meant that her colleagues were not simply covering a prominent breaking news story. They were reporting on an active, living nightmare occurring within their own professional family. The dignity and restraint displayed by the broadcast community during this ongoing crisis stands as a powerful testament to the deep peer empathy that exists behind the scenes of national media. When Savannah temporarily stepped away from her historic duties to anchor herself to her family in Arizona, her co-hosts and production staff built an ironclad perimeter of support around her, managing the coverage with absolute journalistic integrity, while shielding her personal space from unnecessary intrusion. Upon her courageous return to the anchor desk, the collective solidarity of her colleagues provided a steady, visible foundation of strength, reminding the nation that behind the polished exterior of television production is a deeply human network of professionals who understand that family and maternal devotion take precedence over everything else. To fully grasp the psychological framework of this investigation, we must return to the quiet final hours of Saturday, January 31st, 2026. The timeline must be viewed not through the clinical lens of a police report, but through the lived experience of a woman who believed she had safely concluded another normal day. The transition from a warm family dinner to total isolation is a sharp, jarring line that defines the architecture of this crime. When Tommaso Cioni watched Nancy step through her doorway and verified that she was safely inside before her garage door closed at 9:50 p.m., the environment was entirely serene. Nancy moved through her familiar evening routine, placing her Apple Watch and phone on their chargers, actions that represent a total expectation of a normal tomorrow. She did not set a physical alarm because she trusted her neighborhood, her locked doors, and the Google Nest camera watching over her porch. The absolute silence that followed her retirement to her bedroom was not a sign of safety, but the quiet gathering of a storm. Out in the shadows of the foothills, the predator was already on site, waiting for the neighborhood lights to extinguish, calculating the exact moment he would strip away her digital defenses and force her to confront the ultimate intrusion. As the FBI's cyber division continues to process the validated emails received in February and June, the science of digital stylometry has become a critical mechanism in identifying the individual behind the keyboard. While the perpetrators utilized sophisticated anonymizing routing software to mask their physical coordinates, they could not mask the organic habits of their own language. Stylometric analysis examines the subconscious markers embedded within text, word choices, structural syntax, rhythmic punctuation patterns, and spelling anomalies. By running the text of the ransom notes through advanced linguistic databases, Profiling teams can determine a wealth of demographic information about the author, including their primary language, educational background, and regional dialect. The shift in tone between the cold financial demands of the winter and the panicked, apologetic phrasing of the summer note provided a deep look into the psychological state of the writer. The FBI's profiling indicates that the person authoring these emails may be a female associate within the criminal group who has experienced a total moral collapse under the weight of a capital murder investigation. This digital trail is proving that language itself can act as a definitive biometric identifier, narrowing the field of suspects day by day. The legal strategies being prepared by federal prosecutors underscore the uncompromising severity of the charges that await those responsible for Nancy's abduction. The defensive assertions made in the June email claiming that Nancy's death was an unforeseen accident and that no physical harm was intended hold absolutely no validity within the American framework of criminal justice. Under the federal felony murder doctrine, any death that occurs during the commission of an inherently violent felony, such as kidnapping or armed home invasion, is automatically classified as first-degree capital murder. The law establishes that by choosing to commit a violent act, the perpetrators assume full, absolute liability for every consequence that follows. Prosecutors will present evidence that the suspects knowingly removed an 84-year-old heart patient from her life-sustaining daily medications and forced her into a state of extreme psychological terror, an act that carries a near certainty of fatal medical distress. The legal machinery is moving forward with a singular, unyielding focus to ensure that regardless of who held the weapon or who wrote the emails, every single individual involved in the conspiracy is held fully accountable for the ultimate loss of Nancy Guthrie's life. As the investigation enters its 21st week and the blistering summer heat settles over the city of Tucson, the enduring narrative of this case is defined not by the cruelty of an opportunist, but by the unyielding resilience of a mother's legacy. The criminals who breached Nancy's home on February 1st believed they could reduce an independent 84-year-old woman to a mere asset, a transactional chip to be traded for digital currency. Instead, they unleashed a historic wave of community solidarity, law enforcement brilliance, and familial devotion that has completely overwhelmed their criminal enterprise. The $4 million payout they demanded was never achieved. The total digital anonymity they counted on has been systematically dismantled, and the moral weight of their actions has forced them into a terrified, defensive retreat in the shadows. Nancy Guthrie's life marked by decades of quiet grace, community service, and an unbroken devotion to her 3 children cannot be erased by an act of violence. Her name continues to be carried forward by a nation that refuses to stop looking, ensuring that the final chapter of this mystery will be written in a federal courtroom where true, uncompromising justice will be served.